Welcome to the University of New Hampshire School of Law podcast, where professors give legal insight on important news topics. Learn more about the law school at law.unh.edu. Today's guest is Professor John Greabe, Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development, who's an expert in constitutional law and federal courts and procedures. We'll be discussing the retirement announcement of Justice Kennedy and the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh by President Trump. Let's just discuss Justice Kennedy's retirement a little bit.
Sure.
He was a longtime swing vote in the court, leaning conservative primarily, but siding with the liberal side of the court on many social issues. Did Reagan expect that when he nominated him?
Well, the court has shifted so much since the 1980s. I actually, if you could reanimate President Reagan, I think he would probably be on balance, quite pleased with Justice Kennedy's career. The big issue is, of course, abortion. And President Reagan was the first president to campaign on the promise of nominating justices who would overturn Roe versus Wade. And Kennedy famously joined with Justices Souter and Sandra Day O'Connor. They dialed back the holding of Roe versus Wade in 1992, but they preserved the essential part of it, which is that a woman has a qualified right to terminate a pregnancy. Assuming that President Reagan in good faith really wanted to see Roe versus Wade go away. And there are those who say, who've questioned whether certain politicians who have said they want Roe versus Wade to be overturned, whether they really do. But assuming good faith on President Reagan's part, that may be an issue that would have disappointed him. But on balance, Justice Kennedy was really quite conservative. He was the swing justice after Sandra Day O'Connor retired. Sandra Day O'Connor really was more of a swing justice even than Justice Kennedy was. She was she would tend to join with the liberal justices more often than he did. When she retired, he moved into that role. And he's viewed as a swing justice, principally for his rulings in respect to same-sex sexual orientation and protecting those rights that culminated in the same-sex marriage ruling a few years ago, where the Supreme Court held that there's a constitutionally protected right to marry somebody of the same sex. And he was also joined with the liberals in preserving just a sliver of room to maneuver in the affirmative action context. But on balance, he was really quite a conservative justice.
Any other cases that stood out over his career that's really important?
Well, I mean, I think the cases, the legacy is going to focus on the rights of same-sex couples. I think those are going to be the ones that really endure. The affirmative action cases. That affirmative action is pretty clearly on the way out. Even the ruling in 2003 that preserved the right of institutions of higher education to engage in affirmative action imposed such severe constraints that it's very, very difficult to see how, barring a real change in the makeup of the court, how affirmative action is going to be with us, a decade from now. He also, I think we're going to talk about partisan gerrymandering a little bit. He was, of the conservative justices, he was the one who showed the most open-mindedness about the possibility of the court getting involved in partisan gerrymandering. But the court basically punted this term, and he went along with that and then retired.
We'll have a separate podcast coming out on Thursday where we'll go a little more specific into that, which will be awesome.
Oh, okay. All right. Yep. Okay.
Good teaser, though.
Okay, good.
Now, with his retirement, President Trump now gets to select his second Supreme Court justice. First of all, has this happened very often where presidents got to pick more than one Supreme Court justice?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, Obama got two. Oh, he got two over 8 years, though. Yeah. I mean, President Trump has gotten two pretty quickly. And so far, he's picked two people from the same high school. Actually, Justice Gorsuch and Judge Kavanaugh both went to Georgetown Prep and grew up in the suburbs of D.C.
Now, 53-year-old Judge Brett Kavanaugh is a former clerk of Justice Kennedy and a current federal appeals court judge in Washington. What from his career kind of made him stand out as being a candidate for this position?
Well, he's, interestingly, if President Trump, I think, identifies as an outsider, right? Judge Kavanaugh is not an outsider. Judge Kavanaugh is an insider. Judge Kavanaugh, went to Yale College, went to Yale Law School, worked early on the Starr investigation. He was actually the person who was tasked with investigating whether Vince Foster was murdered, if you remember that story. And then he wrote portions of the Starr report. He worked in George W. Bush's White House for about 5 years or so, and he has been a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals now for over a decade. So he's got quite a track record, but he is not somebody from outside the mainstream at all.
Yeah, pretty much. And a quote from him from last night stood out to me from his announcement that basically is conservative judge 101 for me is he said, quote, "A judge must be independent, must interpret the law, not make the law."
That's right.
Which, I mean, that's this basically that's a standard to me for a conservative judge. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen in other speeches he's invoked the image of the umpire. I call balls and strikes. I don't decide what the strike zone is. The strike zone is set, and I try to make my best judgment about whether the ball is in the strike zone or not in the strike zone. That was an image, excuse me, that Chief Justice Roberts used during his confirmation hearings as well. What he's getting at there is that he is a textualist and an originalist. A textualist is somebody who focuses almost exclusively on the text of a statute, or, in the case of a constitutional case, a constitutional provision. An originalist says that the meaning of the text at the moment it became law is what needs to control. And that is, this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but that is really at the heart of the divide between the more liberal and the more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. The textualists and originalists are very concerned about democracy, and they say that when we are interpreting something that is a product of the democratic process, we should not be putting our spin on it, our take on it. Then the other side of that is that, for the Constitution to remain a good Constitution, it needs to be adapted to a changing world. And that it is perfectly legitimate for judges to ask to not only meditate on the meaning of the text. Certainly that matters, and if the text is controlling, it's controlling. But often the text is not controlling, and that in those situations it is appropriate to look at the purpose of the text and to try to figure out how best to apply the principle underlying the text in modern circumstances.
Why do you think President Trump selected Kavanaugh over the other judges? I mean, one of them that stood out as going to be problematic was Amy Coney Barrett, who spoke openly about her Catholic religion being super important and might cause problems down the road. Right. But the other two judges that were also brought in were kind of along the same lines, pretty safe picks, I thought. Yeah.
I mean, all of them are qualified, and in different times. Amy Coney Barrett, because her academic writing, she's never written that she would vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, but combination of her life and her academic writings lead many to conclude that would be likely where she would stand on that issue. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for her from that element of the right that would, that is principally motivated by seeing Roe versus Wade overturned. He's an establishment candidate. He is, I think, going to be acceptable to a wide range of conservatives. We're playing pop psychology. We never know. But the president is being investigated. And Judge Kavanaugh has written that he does not think that it is a good thing that a president can be subject to a civil suit while in office, even though the Supreme Court held 9-0 that's the case. He has expressed some doubts about whether that was a good outcome, and also about whether or not a sitting president can be indicted. Now, and to say that, I would say most people think that a sitting president cannot be indicted, that the remedy is impeachment. But the fact that he's on the record in favor of sort of protecting presidential prerogative from interference by the judicial process, it's hard not to wonder whether, President Trump found that appealing. I don't want to be too cynical about it, but, the president does seem to be a president who thinks about his own interests quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to Roe v. Wade, any predictions on him being in the court, how that might impact things?
Yeah, in fact, I just got off the phone with a Concord Monitor reporter, and so I'm gonna be all over the record now, being wrong again, probably. But I know there's this conventional wisdom out there that they're not going to overturn Roe. It'll be more death by a thousand cuts. What they'll start doing is upholding state laws that further and further intrude on the right. I don't think that's right. I think they are. I think for sure the issue is going to get back to the court relatively quickly, because some state legislature out there will enact a law that is designed to test whether the essential holding of Roe, which is really what's spelled out in a case called Casey versus Planned Parenthood from 1992, whether that's good law. I think there are going to be 5 votes to say let's not fiddle around. There is no constitutional right to an abortion. It's an issue that's to be left to the states to decide. I've been wrong about many, many things, and I may be wrong about that too. But I personally think that is the more likely outcome. I do think that Roe versus Wade, and really actually more telling, we talk about Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade, the holding of Roe versus Wade is essentially gone right now. It's been scaled way, way back by the Supreme Court. But I think Casey, the holding in Casey versus Planned Parenthood from 1992, which preserved the essence of Roe, I think it's on life support.
Is Kavanaugh basically going to fit in pretty comfortably in the middle of the conservatives? Do you feel like? It seems like to me, bringing up his stance on these things, sounds just like Gorsuch.
Yeah,
an outsider.
Yeah, he's been. I think one area where he's likely to do some work is in the field of administrative law, which is very, very important. It doesn't capture the popular attention and popular imagination in the same way, but he has, in his opinions, expressed considerable skepticism about the use of administrative power by bureaucrats in Washington, because we are so dysfunctional right now, because Congress has found it so difficult to act, there have been a couple of consequences. One has been that presidential power has expanded. And one way in which presidential power expands is that the president gets to appoint the heads of various administrative agencies. And then those agencies, under federal law, under current law, are given a fair amount of leeway to interpret the statutes which create them and which authorize them to regulate. And therefore, there's real change that takes place after an election and after a president like Obama is replaced by a president like Trump. And, the EPA goes from somebody who is a committed environmentalist to somebody like Scott Pruitt, who is, basically hostile to the mission of the agency. Judge Kavanaugh, I think, is very, very likely to place some limits on the ability of the administrative state to swing back and forth in that way. Beyond that, I do think I think he will fit pretty comfortably in with the conservatives on the court. He's been a judge for a long time. He's been a feeder to the Supreme Court. He's sent a bunch of his law clerks to then go on and clerk for Supreme Court justices. He and Gorsuch actually clerked for Kennedy at around the same time. I mentioned before they went to the same high school. This guy is going to settle right in and become, I would say, he's 53 years old. He's likely eventually to become a leader, or the leader, I think, of that conservative bloc, especially with Justice Thomas getting older. Gorsuch is about the same age too. So both he and Gorsuch are going to be probably around for quite a long time.
Yeah, definitely. Do you predict any issues with him getting through confirmation? He seems to be the soft take on these harder issues that, like, Senator Susan Collins has spoken out about.
Yeah, I expect, I'd be shocked if he doesn't go through. I think the Democrats are going to raise a ruckus. They already are, and that will, and that they'll try to use this to generate enthusiasm among the base and to get people to vote, which is a problem for Democrats in midterm elections. But at the end of the day, the filibuster was done away with during the Gorsuch nomination for Supreme Court justices. So it just takes a majority of the Senate now. Jeff Flake was pushing back a little bit for a while there with respect to judicial nominations because he doesn't like what the president is doing with tariffs. But he's made clear that he's not going to push back with respect to a Supreme Court nominee. I can't imagine any Republican not voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. And once that becomes clear, I think there'll be some pressure on some so-called red state Democratic senators also to consider voting for him, especially if they view that as an issue that's going to make a difference as they head into re-elections or midterm elections in November.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
Sure.
And we're going to be immediately recording another episode on gerrymandering. This is going to be released this Thursday. So definitely do subscribe to the UNH Law Podcast on iTunes or Google Play. We're on both those services. Or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the whole night, all the regular channels. And we'll be sharing each of these episodes as they come out every week. If you want to learn more about the law school, please go to law.unh.edu. Thanks.